Sorry about the lousy production values on this post today. I have some announcements. First of all, I'm in Kharkov in Ukraine. This is the second largest city of the Ukraine, and I'm here visiting my children who live here with their mother. I am also on a fast, interestingly enough. 6 days on this fast so far. Tomorrow I'm going to have a post about it, so I'll leave it for tomorrow. And it's been quite an interesting experience. But today I wanted to talk about Sweden. Sweden claims that they are the superpower of humanitarianism, which, if you think about it, is the most arrogant thing that you could possibly say. It's basically saying we are humanitarian, more humanitarian than you. We are good, we are grand in our altruism, whereas you just don't quite measure up. Now that, if you think about it, is just the arrogance of altruism. An arrogance of altruism whereby you think that you are better than other people, just by virtue of you helping other people. Now, that is an incredibly un-Christian thing if you think about it. It's an incredibly arrogant thing to think that you're better than other people because you help other people. I mean, helping other people should be something that comes out of your heart, not to show off. But leaving that aside, leaving aside the moral aspect of Sweden's arrogance, and there's a point to why I'm bringing up Sweden. Sweden has had horrible luck with its altruism, with its humanitarianism. And it doesn't seem to learn any of the lessons of that bad luck, of those bad lessons that they should have learned, but they apparently have not. And I'm going to give you an example from Chile. It's kind of weird, you know, my home country is a little bit like Waldo. A citizen of my country, or my country, seems to pop up in the weirdest and most obscure places, and Swedish humanitarianism is no exception. Let me explain. Back in 1973, there was a coup d'etat. A Leninist Maoist regime headed by Salvador Allende was overthrown by a military coup, which implemented a series of economic reforms that created essentially the Chilean economic miracle, which is still strong as of today. But be that as it may, there were a lot of people who wanted to flee the military dictatorship for political reasons, obvious. They were going to be persecuted by the military. And these people sought humanitarian aid, they sought asylum in different places. And Sweden, of all countries, basically instituted an open-door policy in terms of refugees from Chile. Now, these refugees are quote-unquote political refugees. They were supposed to be political refugees. But Sweden advertised its asylum and its benefits so forcefully that it wound up attracting criminals. I mean, a whole criminal underclass emigrated from Chile and went to Sweden because Sweden was promising them benefits, housing, an allowance, lessons in Swedish, blah, 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 all sorts of benefits that were just too good to pass up. And so a lot of people took them up on this offer. They said, sure, I'll go to Sweden, you know, not because they were being persecuted by the military dictatorship, but just because it was just a great deal, especially for poor people, especially for extremely poor people and criminals, a lot of criminals. Now, the Pinochet dictatorship was more than happy to let these people go to Sweden. Now, do keep in mind that in Chile there were never closed borders. You could come and go as you please. You could not enter the country if you had been exiled for political reasons. And that was a relatively small group of, I don't know the figures offhand, but I'd guess around between 5,000 and 10,000 people out of a country of, at that time, about 10 million people. 9 million people at that time. But anyway, this criminal underclass emigrated to Sweden. And they proceeded to wreak havoc in Sweden, and it was hilarious. Now, these people, the Swedes, they welcomed these people, these criminals, with open arms, and they took them at their word that they were political refugees, when in point of fact, they were not. The military dictatorship had no interest in them in terms of politics, certainly in terms of their criminality. They're just larceny and petty theft and the usual. Because in every country in the world, in every society on earth, there's always been a criminal underclass. And that criminal underclass tends to be rather stable. But that's another issue. The issue here is that the Swedes took them all in, and of course, these criminal elements wreaked havoc on Sweden. There is an apocryphal story that goes around in Chile. I mean, in Chile, it was funny, except when you actually go to Sweden. Because when you go to Sweden, you're worried that they're going to look at you funny. Because, of course, there's this apocryphal story that in a supermarket, some Chilean, it's always a friend of a friend, who saw a sign in a Swedish supermarket saying, if you see a Chilean stealing, leave him alone, it's their culture. Which is just absurd, but it goes to show what the Swedes are willing to do. Now, this apocryphal story, I'm sure it actually happened at some point. Most apocryphal stories do happen at one point or another. But my point is, the Swedes allowed this Chilean criminal underclass to blossom in their country. And they didn't do much about them. They didn't put them in prison for their crimes that they committed in Sweden, of course. They didn't try to reform them. They just let them be. That sign, it's an apocryphal story, but I tend to think that it's true because of the word culture. Because of understanding that the Swedes believed that these criminals had a culture of criminality that came from Chile, and that, you had to let them be. Now, of course, in Chile, people are amused and horrified because, of course, Chile is a very law-abiding country. In point of fact, I would argue one of the most law-abiding, if not the most law-abiding country in Latin America, which is why it tends to be a focus of finance and trade, because everybody knows that their money is safe, everybody knows that it's a relatively stable and secure and safe country. But the Swedes looked at these criminals' culture and just decided to let them be. They didn't have any kind of a debate in terms of changing them, in terms of having these immigrants toe the Swedish line. They couldn't set a line. Now, the Swedes were idiotic to allow all these people to go into Sweden. There were several thousand. I don't know the numbers offhand. They're disputed. Something like 11 to 15,000 in the first wave. There were subsequent waves. And they left for economic reasons, though they claimed to the Swedes that they were leaving for political reasons, leaving Chile, that is. There was a wave in '73. Then there was another wave in the 81-82 financial crisis. Again, a lot of economic migrants, practically no political refugees at all in 82, 81, 82, 83. You see, the Swedes just let them in naively, but it's a naivete that cannot be excused in an adult. In a teenager, maybe, but not in an adult. Not in a sovereign government. Now, these Swedes, of course, have gotten a very nasty lesson with the Syrian refugees, but, and here's what's interesting, in Sweden, as many people have commented, there is what is known as the corridor. It is basically a very narrow corridor, hallway, of what you can talk about. And there are a lot of subjects that cannot be talked about. There are a lot of journalists have talked about how Swedes cannot in public refer to specific contentious, controversial topics such as immigrant migration and how they're going to be paid for, etc. Now, Sweden is a classic example, is the sine qua non example of a country that has bought its own humanitarian bullshit. Now, all of us want to help our fellow human beings. It's a natural instinct. We see suffering and when we want to alleviate it. You see some stranger that you've never met before, you know, and his car is wrecked by a tree, and you go to help him, and you call for help, and you comfort him while the ambulance arrives. It's perfectly normal. You see somebody whose house burns down, and you say, come live at my place for a while until you're back on your feet. This is a perfectly natural and wonderful quality that human beings have. We are able to escape our bonds of tribalism in order to help the other who is in need, who is in obvious need. And it's a wonderful thing, but there are limits. You have to have limits. Now, the humanitarian superpower of Sweden arrogantly, in their arrogance, decided that they had no limits. And now something like 10% of their population, the equivalent of 10% of their population, have migrated to them. Muslims who do not know the Swedish culture, do not know Western culture, have no interest in Swedish or Western culture, and in point of fact, many of them have an ideology that aims to destroy the West. And Swedes just welcome them with open arms and are not doing anything, and because of the corridor, they are not talking about this problem that will destroy them. There's no question about it. These immigrants, these migrants, I'm sure most of them are law-abiding, decent people, but these people, these immigrants to Sweden, will eat them alive. Swedes will be a minority in their own country. And we're seeing this throughout Europe. In Germany, in France, in Belgium. Belgium, people don't talk about Belgium, but Belgium is something worth talking about. That place is a fucking disaster. Now, of course, they're not talking about this when they should, because it's good and fine to help your fellow human being, but you have to know your limits, and you have to allow open discourse and discuss these topics. You cannot simply say, we can do it, as Angela Merkel said. Because you can't. Nobody can. Nobody can solve all the suffering in humanity. Leo Tolstoy, the great humanitarian, son of a bitch in the offing, and great novelist to boot, he said that humanitarianism has a limit, and you cannot alleviate all of the suffering of all the world. It is simply impossible for any one person or one people to do that. Now, the arrogance to believe that you can is going to destroy Europe. Now, why am I picking on Sweden? Because Sweden, in its urge to be this humanitarian superpower, is not only having the so-called corridor of what is acceptable to discuss in public, but they're starting to implement rules on the internet, as are other countries in Europe. Germany, the UK, the Tories have this horrifying manifesto that they're planning on implementing. It's something I'm going to be discussing in a future post. But my point is, they are trying to close off all possibilities of communicating about the problem. Their police refuses to discriminate crimes committed by Swedes, native-born, ethnic Swedes, and those who are foreign-born, and those who are ethnically non-Swedes. They refuse to make the discrimination in their statistics. They don't want to see the problem, so they hide it under the rug. Now, when you hide a problem under the rug, it only gets bigger. Now, that's what the Swedes are doing. Now, it should be a lesson to the rest of the world. It should be a lesson that you cannot close off discourse. You have to face problems. And you have to understand that you and I have limits. Everyone has limits. Limits of what is possible, limits to what is prudent, limits to what is advisable, limits to what is sane. The Swedes, in their arrogance to be the humanitarian superpower, are destroying their own nation. That ought to be a lesson.